There's a company whose name once made entire cities tremble, not because of what they sold, because of what they dropped from the sky. Heinkel, Ernst Heinkel, a name synonymous for most of the 20th century with raw air power. His bombers flew over London. His engineers pushed the boundaries of speed and altitude. At the peak of his influence, Ernst Heinkel ran one of the most sophisticated aircraft operations in the world, and then it was all taken away. 1945, Germany is rubble, the war is over, and the Allied Control Commission delivers a verdict that changes everything. You will not build aircraft, not now, not for years. The skies that once belonged to you are closed. So here's the question, and nobody stops to ask. What does an entire engineering team do? Men who spent careers designing machines that flew at 600 kilometers per hour when the one thing they were brilliant at is suddenly forbidden. Most companies collapse. Most men drift. Ernst Heinkel did something nobody expected. He built a car, a tiny bubble-shaped three-wheeled car that looked like someone had stripped a fighter cockpit and bolted it onto a scooter engine. It was called the Heinkel Kabine. Between 1956 and 1958, it became one of the most ingenious and most forgotten vehicles in automotive history. But this isn't really a car story. It's a story about what men do under impossible pressure, about how the most elegant solutions come from the most desperate circumstances, and about why the things built purely for survival sometimes become what future generations fight to own. Stay with me. The details here are stranger than anything a screenwriter would dare invent. Post-war Germany wasn't just economically broken, it was psychologically shattered. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, reduced to rubble, fuel rationed, infrastructure gone. The average German family couldn't dream of owning a real automobile. But people still needed to move, to work, to rebuild. That gap between the need to travel and the inability to afford anything created one of the most fascinating moments in industrial history. A new category of vehicle was born. The Germans called them Kleinstwagen, ultra-small cars, or Kabinenroller, cabin scooters, 3 wheels, tiny engines, barely room for a person and a bag of groceries, but they worked. And in a country on its knees, working was everything. This was the world Ernst Heinkel stepped into, not by choice, by necessity. And what his engineers produced was, against every expectation, a small miracle of compressed design thinking. Heinkel's engineering team weren't hobbyists. These were aeronautical engineers of the highest order. Men who had designed aircraft flying at over 600 kilometers per hour. Men who understood aerodynamics and structural efficiency at a level that commands respect even today. Their greatest achievement wasn't a bomber, it was something far more radical. On the 27th of August, 1939, the Heinkel He-178 lifted off from a runway in Rostock. It was the world's first aircraft to fly under jet power alone. Before the British, before the Americans, Heinkel's team got there first. These were the men now being asked to build something with a 174 cubic centimeter engine. Something under 250 kilograms, something a pensioner could park outside a post office. You might expect the result to be uninspired. Half-hearted, the work of brilliant minds enduring a humiliating detour. It was the opposite. When engineers of this caliber face extreme constraints, something remarkable happens. They don't produce mediocre work, they produce concentrated genius. Every gram earns its place. Every decision has to be correct because there is no room for anything unnecessary. The Kabine that debuted in 1956 proved exactly that. 3 wheels, 2 at the front, 1 at the rear. A single-cylinder 4-stroke engine producing around 9.5 horsepower, top speed approximately 87 kilometers per hour, seating for one adult with space for two small children behind, under 250 kilograms total. On paper, modest. In reality, precise and considered in every detail. But the feature that made the Kabine genuinely unforgettable had nothing to do with the engine. It was the door, or more precisely, the complete absence of one. There was no side door. Instead, the entire front of the vehicle opened, windshield, nose, steering column, swinging outward on a hinge exactly like an aircraft cockpit canopy. You entered from the front, the steering wheel rotated out of your way, then locked back once you were seated. This wasn't showmanship. It was a precise solution to a real problem. In the narrow streets of post-war German cities, opening a conventional side door was often physically impossible. The front entry system meant the cabine could fit spaces no regular car could use, and the driver could still get in and out without difficulty. Aircraft thinking, street-level reality. It worked beautifully. That detail tells you everything about how these men approached problems. They didn't just solve what was asked, they anticipated what wasn't. That gap between solving what's obvious and anticipating what isn't is what separates engineering that lasts from engineering that gets forgotten. And this engineering was about to travel further than anyone expected. Here's what surprises most people, especially those who grew up in Britain. The Heinkel Kabine didn't stay German for long. In 1957, Heinkel licensed the design to Trojan Limited, based in Croydon, Surrey. Trojan had been building unconventional vehicles since the 1920s. They understood what a working man needed, and when they looked at the cabine, they saw something worth backing. The British version was sold simply as the Trojan. Same front-opening canopy, same three-wheel layout, built on British soil for British roads and British budgets, for anyone over 50 who grew up in the United Kingdom. These cars were on your streets, not in museums, on actual roads, driven by real people managing tight budgets in a country still quietly recovering from the cost of winning a war. Because victory didn't mean prosperity, rationing didn't fully end until 1954. A three-wheeled cabin scooter at a fraction of a conventional car's price wasn't a compromise. It was a lifeline. Now here's where the story gets genuinely strange. Because the cabine wasn't alone in this market, and its main competitor carried a name just as historically loaded as Heinkel's own. Messerschmitt. Same restrictions, same ban on aircraft, same pool of aeronautical engineers with nowhere useful to send their expertise. Messerschmitt had produced the KR-175 and the more refined KR-200, three-wheeled, aircraft-influenced, built by men who had spent the war designing fighter planes. So in the mid-1950s, something almost cinematic was unfolding on European roads. Former warplane manufacturers, whose aircraft had fought each other over Britain, France and North Africa, were now commercial rivals in the microcar market, selling tiny vehicles to the very civilians whose cities their bombers had once targeted. History has a dark sense of humor. The rivalry was real. The Messerschmitt KR-200 used tandem seating, passenger behind the driver like a two-seat aircraft. The Heinkel Kabine offered side-by-side seating, more familiar, more car-like. Two different philosophies, two different answers to the same desperate question. For a while, both found their audience, but something was being developed in the British Midlands that would make this entire category obsolete. Not gradually. Almost overnight. Before we get there, if you've seen one of these on the road or knew someone who drove one, tell me in the comments the year, the place, what you remember. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Every week this channel goes deep into stories like this one. Real history, real machines, real consequences, hit like If this is earning your time, share it with someone who'd appreciate history told straight. And leave a comment. What stayed with you so far? Right, 1959, and the car that ended everything, 1959. Keep that year in mind. A car rolled out of the British Motor Corporation that would quietly destroy the microcar market, designed by Alec Isigonis, called the Mini. It didn't compete with bubble cars. It made them unnecessary. The Mini wasn't dramatically cheaper than a Heinkel Kabine. It wasn't vastly more powerful. What it was normal. 4 wheels, 4 seats, a proper boot. A car that looked like a car and didn't require you to explain to your neighbors why you were climbing in through the front windscreen. For working families who had been buying microcars out of necessity, the Mini said something psychologically enormous. The compromise is over. You can have a real car at a real price. The calculation shifted almost overnight. The microcar had existed because there was no better option. The moment a better option arrived, its reason for existing evaporated. Kabine sales collapsed. The Trojan version followed. Messerschmitt attempted a 4-wheeled variant, but the market had moved on. By the early 1960s, the bubble car era was over. But here's what most histories get wrong. Heinkel didn't fail. They didn't walk away because the Kabine was a bad product. They stepped away in 1958, just ahead of the Mini, because the aviation restrictions were lifting. The skies were opening again. And the moment they could return to what they had always truly been, builders of aircraft engines, the technology of flight, they went back. Without hesitation, without sentiment. The Kabine was never the destination, it was the bridge. And once you've crossed a bridge, you don't carry it with you. By the early 1960s, Heinkel was back in aerospace, contributing to jet engine programs, working on components for aircraft that would define the next generation of aviation. The 3-wheeled bubble car became a footnote in a story that was always about something larger. And yet that footnote carries a peculiar weight. Approximately 6,000 Heinkel Kabines were built in total. Volkswagen produced hundreds of thousands of Beetles per year during the same period. The Kabine was barely a whisper, but today, a well-preserved Heinkel Kabine sells at auction for between £15,000 and £30,000, sometimes more. A car a working man bought in 1957 because he had no better option is now a serious collector's asset. Scarcity does strange things to value. Time does stranger things still. The men who drove these cars to work, outside factories in Birmingham, outside shops in Hamburg, had no idea. They were just trying to get through the week. That is the invisible irony in almost every piece of genuine history. The things built purely for survival without ambition or pretension are often the things that endure longest. But there is one more layer, the most uncomfortable one, and it cannot be left out. Let's talk about Ernst Heinkel, the man, not the brand, the man. Because you cannot tell this story honestly without acknowledging what came before the Kabine. Ernst Heinkel was born in 1888 in Grunbach, southern Germany. Obsessed with flight from childhood, he built his first aircraft company in the 1920s. By the 1930s, he was one of the most powerful industrial figures in Germany. And then came the war. Heinkel's factories produced aircraft for the German military throughout the Second World War. His bombers flew over Britain, his fighters engaged Allied aircraft across occupied Europe. And, this is the part history cannot soften, his factories used forced labor. Men and women taken from concentration camps and occupied territories, forced to build aircraft under conditions that were brutal and deliberately dehumanizing. This is documented historical record. Not disputed. It matters. Because when we admire the ingenuity of the Kabine, the front opening canopy, the precision engineering, the concentrated expertise, we must hold that admiration alongside the full weight of what that same company had been part of just a decade before. History rarely delivers clean heroes, particularly not in 20th century Europe, particularly not in Germany between 1933 and 1945. Heinkel was tried at the Nuremberg military tribunals in proceedings relating to forced labor. He was ultimately acquitted, but the historical record of what happened inside his factories is not in serious dispute. He died in 1958. The same year, cabine production ended. So where does that leave us? With complexity, which is exactly where honest history always leaves us. The cabine was a genuine act of engineering brilliance under extraordinary constraint. True, it was produced by a company that had used human beings as disposable industrial resources just years before. Also true, both facts exist simultaneously. Neither cancels the other. For men over 50, this kind of moral complexity is not new territory. You've lived long enough to know the world doesn't divide into clean categories. The most important stories are almost always layered, almost always uncomfortable. The Heinkel Kabine is all of those things. A story about reinvention under duress, about expertise finding new expression in humbling circumstances, about a company whose history demands we look at the full picture more, not just the charming bubble car at auction, but everything that came before it. That full picture is what this channel is committed to, not the comfortable version, the real one. Here's what nobody frames correctly about the Heinkel Kabine. It wasn't built by men who wanted to build it. It was built by men with no other choice. And they built it with everything they had anyway. That distinction is the entire point, because this tiny three-wheeled footnote is ultimately a story about what human beings do when everything they mastered, everything they built, everything they were, gets taken away, not gradually, all at once. Most people, when they lose the thing that defined them, stop. They grieve what used to be. They look backwards at a version of themselves that no longer exists, unable to see what could still be built from what remains. Heinkel's engineers didn't do that. They sat down. They applied every gram of expertise, forged in the most demanding technical environment imaginable, to the most unglamorous problem they had ever faced. How do you move a person safely from one place to another with almost no money, almost no space, and almost no margin for error? The answer was the cabine. Precise, considered, quietly brilliant. A front-opening canopy that nobody had thought of, because nobody who understood cockpit design had ever been forced to think about parking on a narrow street in Stuttgart. Constraint plus expertise, desperation plus discipline. That combination produces things that comfort and abundance almost never can. Think about your own life. The moments where your best work didn't come from ideal conditions. It came when the options ran out, the forced change that turned out to be right, the loss that clarified what mattered, the period doing work that felt beneath you, that built something essential. That is the cabine, in metal and glass and rubber, and its disappearance carries a lesson too. It didn't fail, it was outgrown. The Mini arrived, the world moved on, but unnecessary is not worthless. The 6,000 people who drove a cabine in 1957 got where they needed to go. Some put children in the back, children now in their 60s and 70s, who might still remember laughing at the funny little car with the door that opened from the front. If that's you, drop it in the comments. The year, the place, what you remember. That living memory is irreplaceable. The Heinkel Kabine deserves better than a footnote. It was a serious act of reinvention by serious men in a serious moment. Men who refused to let the end of one chapter be the end of the story. When the thing you were built for disappears, and for all of us eventually, something we were built for disappears, the question is never whether you can go back. You can't. The question is what you build next, and whether you bring the same discipline and refusal to do mediocre work to whatever comes after. Heinkel's men did, in the most unlikely vehicle imaginable. If this story gave you something, subscribe right now. Every week this channel goes deep into real history, real machines, real men. Like this video if it earned your time. Share it with someone who appreciates history told straight. Leave a comment. What stayed with you most? Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.